Morgen ist wieder gesund.
Aber willst du das auch wieder
Und eigentlich auch.
So welcome everybody and New Year. So this also time that shows that the topic of this lecture is very important for today's developments. So I think that the events in Venezuela and the threat to Greenland raise many questions that are quite close to the topics that we have been dealing with. And I should also point out that the work in progress that I presented last time we met has now become a preliminary paper, so I may put the paper in the blackboard so that you can have a look at it, and of course I'll be happy to hear comments, and if you find out any mistake, also this will help. So today is going to be the last session on for the first part of the course. So the course is in 3 unequal parts. So the first part is about models of war outbreak, and this is the last week for this first part. Then next week we'll begin with the second part. The second part is about the origins of collective aggressivity. So from a theoretical point of view, all models that we have been dealing with, and also today's model, all those models simply posit a certain preferences for grabbing resources from other countries, and this raises the question whether this aggression is something that is necessarily there, or are there mechanisms that may shape the degree of aggression. So we discuss, so to speak, the indigeneity of preferences for taking resources from others by violent means. And then in the third part we will discuss some ethical and normative aspects, and we will also talk by an internationally renowned scholar, Professor Krieger, from our nearby colleagues from the law department. So today we will have a look at an important issue, which is especially related to empires. So up to now, we have mostly dealt with international disputes that faced two states of similar power. For instance, two superpowers armed with nuclear weapons, or two states that use conventional means. But we did not posit any strong asymmetry. In reality, there have been historically empires that have a very strong military machine, and many militarily weaker states. And many of these military weaker states historically were colonies of the empire that could use different means in order to exploit the colonies, so as to gain some material advantages out of the colony. So, and this is the kind of situation that we are going to discuss. So, and the difference with respect to the models we saw before is that empires face not just one enemy in this perspective. Of course, there may be several empires that fight against each other, but this is not the topic. The topic is now the asymmetric relationship between the core country of the empire and the colonies or provinces or vassal states, as you may call them. And an important aspect that is in this type of relationship is that what the empire does with respect to one colony may signal something to the other colonies. In particular, the core country of the empire, they want to cultivate a reputation for toughness, for being unwilling to compromise, in order to impress the remaining colonies so that they stay peaceful and obey the diktats of the empire. Some pundits have also interpreted the Ukrainian war in these terms. So the idea is Moscow has a number of satellite states in its sphere of influence, and they may depart from it, and fighting Ukraine before it departs may signal that Russia is tough, and thanks to the signal, the remaining vassal states will stay peaceful. So that this may contribute to explain the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a way to signal to other small states that if they dare to exit the Russian empire, if you wish, then they will face hard consequences. This is a very old idea. The Latins said, unum castigabis, centum emendabis. In English they say, punish one to educate 100. Punish one to educate 100. It was also a maxim of Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution. So, by being hard toward a single target, you signal that you are a tough guy, and you impress and educate and pacify all other that are in a similar position of submission to you. Unum castigabis centum or centum emendabis. So, and this is something that could also explain a lot of smaller conflicts during the Cold War. During the Cold War, so they used to say, oh, we had peace during the Cold War, so it was actually great. But if you look at it more in detail, actually there were many wars, and typically these were wars where some country tried to escape the sphere of influence of a great power, but the great power fought it back in order to avoid that country to become independent of the great power. So for the US empire, one may mention the Korea War, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, and for the Soviet Empire, one may mention the GDR in 1953, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, 68, Afghanistan, 1980. So these were all countries that tried to escape the domination of the superpower, but they were held in check by the empire. And one possible explanation, because some of these conflicts were extremely costly for the empire. So an explanation for this is that the benefit for the empire was not just to keep that country in, but it was also to signal to the remaining ones that they would be tough. So this is a signal. This suggests that empires attach value for having a reputation for resolve, for toughness, for resolve. And this is precisely what we want to study today. So in general, reputation, what is reputation in economics? So reputation is the belief about some feature of the agent that is held by other agents that interact with this agent, and this belief influences those other agents' behavior, and reputation is like a capital stock, or goods that can be accumulated by costly actions, like an investment in capital. You have to incur costs in order to impress the others, in order to convince the others that you have certain characteristics, and you have to cultivate that reputation, because otherwise your reputation may erode over time, and then the others change their beliefs about you, and then reputation that is not so advantageous to you anymore. So it's, in this sense, reputation is similar to an asset. This you find also in firms. So, for instance, made in Germany was valuable because it was attached to the belief that products that came from Germany, say cars, were high quality. So quality was not directly observable, not coming from Germany, you attached a positive belief to quality. But if you are a firm that has some reputation and then you start to sell low quality products, selling them as high quality, then this starts to erode your reputation, and then you cannot command anymore a high price for your products. So this is one standard interpretation. Another application of the concept of reputation in economics is with respect to market competition. So there are markets in which there is an incumbent, and the incumbent is a monopoly, and therefore enjoys a monopoly rent. And for instance, the most important example is the chain store example. So there is say Walmart, and they are in a monopoly position, and they have many localities, and they are local monopolies in each locality. And the question is whether the monopolist is willing to fight entrants in local markets. And again, here reputation matters, but in this case, in order to discourage potential entrants to fight to enter the market and deprive you of your monopoly rents. So if you have this chain store, and then in some location an entrant enters, if you accommodate the entrant in the sense that you simply reduce your prices so that your monopoly rents disappear, and the entrant earns some market profit, this would encourage also other entrants in other markets to enter. But if you have a reputation for being tough, that is to say, if somebody dares to enter, then you conduct predatory pricing, so that you react aggressively, for instance, by temporarily underselling a rival, doing a lot of advertising, and so on, so that you lose profits, but you lead your entrant competitor to bankruptcy. Then you have a costly, for instance, price war against this entrant, and on this particular market you are making losses, but you are gaining a reputation for toughness, for not tolerating competitors in your local markets, and then they will not enter in the other markets. Same reasoning for mafia. So if you are a criminal organization and you have the control of drug distribution, again, there may be an entrant that wants to enter your market, and then you may either accommodate or fight the entrant. And if you accommodate, you lose a bit. If you fight, you lose a lot in that particular market. because maybe there will be killings. But you gain the reputation for being a kind of padrino, pate. So, and then the others will not dare to enter. So this is the same logic in international relations. So now we're going to look at this issue in a model that uses the concept of sequential equilibrium or perfect Bayesian equilibrium, which is the equilibrium concept that we used last time. So we will have to have a dynamic situation and one in which there is asymmetric information. So beliefs will be endogenously determined, and we have to have coherence both with respect to the choice of behavior and to the formation of beliefs. So this is why the concept of perfect Bayesian equilibrium and sequential equilibrium, these are very related concepts, are the right ones. Okay, so we start with a very simple situation, and then we make it a little bit more complicated. There are two types of players. So there is a single long-run incumbent, which is the empire in our application. And this incumbent faces a sequence of entrants. These are colonies that may struggle for independence. This is the asymmetry I talked about before. So, and in each period, there is a possibility for one colony to decide whether to struggle for independence or to stay peaceful. So, if it stays peaceful, then the exploitation goes on as before and nothing changes. But if it struggles for independence, then the empire or the core country, so the other is the periphery then, decides whether to accept the loss of this colony, to accommodate, or to fight back. And then there will be some random outcome. The key thing for reputation is that there is asymmetric information with respect to the nature of the incumbent. And in this paper, or in this model, also for the entrant. So the incumbent, the empire, we do not know. It can be of two types. So there is the tough type, no? And the weak type. So the prior probability that the empire or the core country is tough is P0, and with probability 1 minus P0, the empire is weak. With respect to the entrants, we also assume two possible types. So with probability Q0, the entrant is tough, and with the complementary probability, it is weak. The important thing is that the type of the colony changes from one colony to the next, can change. So the colonies have types that are statistically independent of each other and drawn from the same distribution, Q0, 1 minus Q0. So, conversely, the incumbent has a certain type, and this type does not change over the entire horizon. Okay? So, these are the payoffs. For the entrant, so the entrant would be, say, some political force in a colony, an important political force in the colony that can decide whether to stay peaceful or to struggle for independence. So, if the entrant does not struggle for independence, so it stays out, so to speak, it doesn't question the power of the empire, then we normalize the payoffs to 0. If it struggles for independence, then the payoff, which is the expected payoff, will depend on the reaction of the empire, of the core. If the core fights back, then there is a war, and the expected payoff is -1 for the entrant. If instead the core accepts independence, it accommodates, then the entrant gets a benefit B, positive, strictly positive. So, for the entrant, entry and accommodation is the preferred outcome, and civil war or a war against the empire is the worst outcome. For the incumbent, so if there is no entry, there is the monopoly rent, which is denoted by A, strictly positive. If there is struggle for independence and the monopoly fights it back, then the payoff for the incumbent is -1. If instead the incumbent does not fight back and accepts the independence of the colony, then accommodating leads to 0 payoff. So that for the incumbent, the preferred outcome is that the colony stay peaceful, and the worst outcome is that there is a war. Yes.
But couldn't one imagine also a case where, for the entrants, for example, fighting leads to a situation where they are better off than staying out because they kind of win part of the fight and get a part of the cake which is better than staying out, and also for the incumbents.
This is the second type. So this is the weak type. The tough type always prefer to fight. So this is the definition of types. So the weak types are, so to speak, normal people with these payoffs. And then, however, there are also types that are always ready to fight, and so the tough type, in the case of the entrant, will always enter. It would not make any trade-off. It would always enter, and the tough empire would always fight if there is entry. Yes.
Could you please explain why, for the incumbent, the payoff is 0 if the entrant accommodates in the market? We just stick to this example, because the entrant gets a positive accommodation, a positive result if he accommodates. But how can it be just 0 for the incumbent and not negative if there's accommodation for the entrant?
Well, the level is completely, so these are von Neumann-Morgenstern utility functions, so you can you can change by affine transformation the payoffs, and all results will get true. So if you if you don't like that this is 0 and this is b.
Yeah.
So then put a minus b here, and then you have 0, and everything constant. So this is the game tree, and the payoffs are for the weak types. So the tough types are what in game theory are called behavioral types. So they just do things, and we do not explain why they do it. So we have the entrant and the incumbent. So the entrant chooses whether to stay out or to enter. If it enters, then the incumbent, the umpire, must decide whether to accommodate or to fight back the entrant. So, and in the whole game, this will be repeated for every colony. So that the umpire will face many situations like this in a sequential way, whereas each colony faces it just once. So let us examine this game, first of all, in the simplest case in which the game is played only one time, that is, there is only one colony, and the information is full, in the sense that it is well known that the entrant is weak and the incumbent is weak. So then this is the simplest case. So in the simplest case, we have two Nash equilibria. So one equilibria is entrant stay out and the incumbent fights back, and the other equilibrium is the entrant enters and the incumbent accommodates. So let us check that these are indeed the best replies to each other. So given that the entrant stays out, then for the incumbent it is irrelevant what it chooses. So fighting is a best reply to out. So given that the incumbent fights an entrant, the entrant would get -1 if it enters, and therefore it is better for the entrant to stay out. So staying out is the best reply to expected fight. So this is also Nash equilibrium. So given that the entrant enters, the best reply for the incumbent is to accommodate, because accommodation leads to 0 instead of -1. Given that the incumbent accommodates, the entrant compares staying out and getting 0 or entering and getting B. And this is better, so it is better to enter. So these are both Nash equilibria. So this is an important game because it led to the idea of subgame perfection. So, so the only German Nobel Prize for economics, Reinhard Zelten, was key in order to develop this concept. So it was pointed out that this Nash equilibrium is not very appealing because it is supported by a threat that is not credible. if assume that we focus on this equilibrium. So now, what would happen if the entrant enters instead of staying out? Well, for the incumbent, it would be better to accommodate. But if we anticipate this, then this cannot be an equilibrium. This is the intuition why the first one is not credited. And so it was developed this refinement of subgame perfect equilibrium. Subgame perfect equilibrium is a Nash equilibrium which is an equilibrium play, a Nash equilibrium in all games, subgames that are included in the game. What are subgames? These are games that start from any node of the game. So here we have the game tree, and we have the whole game that starts from this node, but we also have a node here. So here we have a trivial game in which there is only one player that decides, player incumbent. So subgame perfection requires that also in nodes that are not reached by equilibrium play in the Nash equilibrium, also in these games, a Nash equilibrium is played. So in this case, a Nash equilibrium trivially is just choosing the strategy that is maximizing the payoff of player I. And this is, in this case, always to accommodate. So that this kills the first Nash equilibrium. The first Nash equilibrium is not subgame perfect. So that we are going to focus on this one, which is also in incomplete information as equation equilibrium. Okay, so this is the situation. This is the situation which created a lot of discussion at the time. Why? Because we think subgame perfection is a quite appealing concept, and it predicts in such a framework that the potential entrant does enter and the incumbent accommodates. However, suppose that there is a chain store, so that there is not just one market or one colony. Let's talk about markets. One market, but 100 markets. This would imply that the incumbent would lose all 100 markets. And this seems strange. And this is, however, a necessary implication of subgame perfection. And we can modify the prediction only if we introduce some incomplete information. And this is precisely what we are going to do. So first of all, let us do it in the simplest case, in which we have one colony, so again a static situation, so to speak, but now with two types for each layer. The entrant can be tough or weak, and with probability Q0 and 1 minus Q0, and the incumbent can be tough or weak with probability P0 and 1 minus P0. So now So we have only to discuss the weak types because the tough types they always enter and always fire. So it is interesting only to discuss the weak types. So now the weak types, the weak entrant knows that it will be fought by a tough incumbent, but it will not be fought by a weak incumbent. So, what is then the optimal decision for the potential entrant? Well, it depends if the expected payoff of entry is larger or smaller than 0, which is the payoff of staying out. So, what is the expected payoff of entry? So, with probability P0, the empire is tough and will fight me back, and then I will get -1. With probability 1 minus P0, the empire is weak and will accommodate my entry, and then I will get the benefit of independence, B. So this is my expected payoff from entry, which can be positive or negative, depending on the values B and P0. And this payoff here is positive if the ex-ante probability or prior probability that the empire is tough is small, smaller than a certain threshold, B divided by 1 plus B, which is gotten from putting this equal to 0. And we denote this threshold by P alpha bar. This means if the prior probability that the empire is tough is very large, is larger than P alpha bar, then the entrant, if it is normal, weak, will not struggle for independence. But if the prior probability that the empire is weak is large or is small, then it will. So the weak incumbent, as we saw before, accommodates. And what is its payoff? Well, if the incumbent has a probability, prior probability smaller than P0, smaller than P alpha bar, then there will be entry for sure, and it will accommodate entry. So it will get a payoff of 0. Of course, also if the entrant is tough and enters, it will be accommodated. Then that's 0. Instead, if the prior probability of toughness is larger than P alpha bar, then if the potential entrant is weak, then it will not enter. So in this case, it will get its the incumbent will get its monopoly rank. Its payoff from exploitation of the colony. So if the entrant is weak, which occurs with this probability, 1 minus Q0, then the empire gets A, the payoff from exploitation. So, and here you see that the empire benefits from a large P0. So, if the prior probability that the empire is tough is large, then it has an expected payoff that is strictly positive. 1 minus P0 is positive, A is positive. Whereas if the prior probability P0 is small, then it gets only 0. So this begins to trigger the intuition of the importance of reputation. So now there is no strategy of building a reputation because the game is static. But you understand that this P0 will come out of some history. And here you see that the incumbent attaches a value to the belief held by the colony that the incumbent is tough. So the incumbent would be ready to pay something in order to raise the belief P0 of the entrant that the incumbent is tough. Okay. So now we are ready to start the interesting, the most challenging part. Are there questions about the basic framework? Okay, so now, so instead of getting to the case of any possible number of colonies, which becomes quite cumbersome, we deal with the case of 2 colonies, which is enough in order to get the intuition. So maybe another interpretation. So another interpretation of this is, so I mentioned at the beginning that there were, for instance, Vietnam. This is Vietnam. This is the United States, and then Vietnam starts an independence war, and the U.S. or France and the U.S. then fight back. However, there are also many examples where there was a struggle for independence and the incumbent accommodated. So this is the case for the decolonization of the 50s. So many European countries used to have colonies in Africa. So 1960, for instance, was declared the year of African independence because many countries declared independence from their former European empires. So these would be examples for accommodation. So, and these were also, were also cases in which P0 was low. So think about Belgium or Netherlands, Portugal, France. Well, they fought Algeria back. It was a very dramatic development. The UK, of course, was also big. Okay. So now we have a truly dynamic situation with 2 periods, and we allow for discounting the future to some discount factor delta. Delta between 0 and 1, but strictly positive. Could also be 1, however. So, what is now the issue? Now the issue is that also a relatively weak empire may choose to mimic the tough type in the first period in order to impress the colony of the second period so that the colony of the second period stay out. So this is the underlying logic that we want to scrutinize. Is there an incentive for a normal, so to speak, or weak empire to to fight in the first period, and so doing deviating from what was optimal in the one period case, in order to deter entry in the second period. This can only work if by fighting in the first period you can signal that you are tough. Signal in the sense that you can raise the belief held by your opponent that you are tough. And of course, the opponent is not silly. The opponent knows that you have an incentive to bluff and to mimic. So this can be complicated. So there are two big cases to consider. So the first is the first one is also the simple one, in which nothing new happens. And this is the case in which the cost of reputation building, that is of changing the belief so that you deter your adversary, is larger than the return of reputation building. So then this strategy of the normal empire to mimic toughness is not interesting. So when is this the case? Well, what is the cost of reputation building? Well, the cost of reputation building lies in the fact that in the first period, instead of accommodating entry, if it occurs, and getting then 0, you fight it back. And we assume that in this case, the payoff of the incumbent is -1, so that the cost is 1. So what is then the return of this fighting? The return of this fighting is that in the next period, instead of getting 0, because if you do not fight, you signal that you are weak, and then there will be entry in any case. The colony does not enter, and then you get the rent. But this happens only if the entrant of the second colony is not tough, because the tough entrant enters anyway. So then your efforts in the first period are meaningless in that case.
But is my effort, do I not to have also consider the probability that it comes to a fight when I look at the costs? Because it must depend somehow on how probable that it is that the other enters. Because only then I have to pay the costs.
Yes, this is here. So the probability that you do not have an entry, thanks to the fact that you have convinced the weak entrant, of the second colony not to enter is 1 minus Q0, because with probability Q0 it enters anyhow. With probability Q0 it enters anyhow. With this probability it is weak and then it is convinced not to enter, in which case you get as incumbent A. So this is your expected payoff, view from the viewpoint of the second period and view from the viewpoint of the first period. This is also here. You discount it with delta. So the cost of reputation building is larger than the return if this inequality is met, which is the case if the prior probability that the entrant is tough is sufficiently large, larger than a threshold that we denote by Q up a bar. So if I'm almost sure, so the frequency of tough entrants, so these are revolutionaries that are fanatic for independence and will tough in any case. So if this probability is very large, if Q0 is very large, then it doesn't pay to build a reputation, to fight, because they do not react on this information, the tough entrants. The tough entrants enter, simply. Even if they know or they're pretty sure that I'm a tough guy, they will struggle for independence in any case. So if the colonies are often dominated by tough rebels, then this strategy of building a reputation is not interesting. It becomes interesting if Q0 is smaller than Q up a bar. So, then, if we are in this situation, then we are like in the static game. The weak empire never fights, the weak entrant. So now I follow the literature and I denote by entrant 2 the entrant in the first period, and entrant 1 will be the colony that is dealt with in the second period. So it is not so actually there is a logic behind, but it is a bit confusing at the beginning. So the entrant, the incumbent faces first entrant 2 and then entrant 1. Okay? So the outcome is as follows. So the weak entrant 2, which is the first to enter, enters if and only if P0 is smaller than P up a bar, as we saw before. It's just like in the static game. So, and if it does not enter, then also the entrant 1 next to it, well, also it will not enter because it will face no additional information about the empire. And also entrant 2 will think that the probability that it is tough is P0. So, if instead there was entry in the first period, because for instance, because it was tough, in any case, the incumbent will not fight entry if it is weak, and it will fight it in any case if it is tough. This means that observing the behavior following entry in period 1 reveals the type of the incumbent to the colony of period 2, colony 1. So, and then a weak entrant will enter if there is no fight in colony 2. So, this is related to the so-called domino effect in international relations. So, this was one of the main arguments for being tough in Vietnam for the US. So otherwise, if we let Vietnam become an independent state, then all other countries will follow like a domino, and then they all will be gone. And so this is similar here. If the empire does not fight entry in period 1, then it reveals that it is weak, and then also in period 2 they will get out. They will entry. Okay. So now the interesting case is if we have the reverse inequality. If Q0, the probability that colonies are tough is not too large, then they reason and then might be impressed by fighting behavior, also by a weak empire. So, and here we have, first of all, a change as compared to the static model with incomplete information. So now, in this case, the weak incumbent is willing to fight in colony 2, which is the first period, if doing so deters later entry. And this means that if entrant 2 in the first period enters, then the empire, even if it's weak, it will fight back with some positive probability. So, proof by contradiction. So we are claiming that the weak empire fights back entry in the first period against colony 2. So now suppose the contrary. Suppose that in equilibrium the weak incumbent does not fight back with some positive probability, but accommodates for sure. So then, by deviating to fighting, the empire, so I use she for the empire and he for the colony. The empire would make that entrant would make that entrant 1, so the next one, believe that the empire is tough for sure. But if the incumbent is tough, then it will fight back entry in period 2. Then the entrant in period 2, entrant of colony 1, would stay out. And then the total expected payoff of the incumbent would increase thanks to this deviation. It would increase for the reasoning that we made before, that the return of reputation building is larger than the cost of building reputation if this inequality is met. So, indeed, if we are in this situation in which there are sufficiently many colonies that are governed by sensible rebels, so that we can impress them, so that Q0 is small enough, then there will be a difference in behavior as compared to the static case. A difference of behavior with respect especially to the entire. So this is just the first step, however. So because then we have to ascertain with what probability, with which probability the incumbent fights back entry in the first period. So now we have just said, well, it will fight back entry, also the weak incumbent in the first period. But we have not said if it will fight entry every time or only sometimes. Sometimes fighting means that there will be some randomized decision to fight back or not. So it will fight back with some probability. Okay, so now we stay within the overall case in which Q0 is smaller than Q upper bar, so that this reputation building plays a role. And then we discuss two subcases. First one is the case in which the empire has, so you can put it here, so this is P0, this is 1, this is 0. And then there is a P upper bar. Remember, P upper bar was the threshold level that we calculated before, B divided by 1 plus P. This is the threshold for entry by a weak incumbent, a weak entrant in the one column case. So now let us consider the case in which the prior probability that the empire is tough, so that Putin is really obsessed, is in this range here. So now the fighting back in the first period is done in order to impress the colony of the second period. So we have to assess how the posterior beliefs of colony 1, which is floating period, how these posterior beliefs are affected by the fighting of entry in period 1. So then we apply Bayes' rule. So we want to determine what is the probability that the empire is tough, given that we observed that it fought in the previous period. Probability that the empire is tough, given that there was fight in colony 2. So by Bayes' rule, this is equal to this one. So we have the conditional probability of observing fight given that he is tough. This is 1. Because the tough is a behavioral type that always fights. Multiplied by the probability that the prior probability that the empire is tough, and this was P0. And what is the probability of having fight? Well, is equal to the probability that the empire is tough, because in this case, fight always occurs. So this is P0, the probability that the empire is tough, times 1, the frequency of fighting by tough people, tough guys, plus the probability that the empire is normal, times some probability that we have to, probability that the weak type, the weak empire fights. This will be denoted by beta. So this we have to determine. So beta is the conditional probability that a weak empire fights the struggle for independence of colony 2. Okay, so this is this probability. This is the probability assigned by the colony 1, after observing a fight in the previous period. So, what can we see? Well, you see that if beta, so beta is the probability, is the conditional probability that the weak incumbent fights entry in colony 2. So, if beta is equal to 1, then we have here P0 plus 1 minus P0, so this is 1, so this is P0. So in this case, the probability that the incumbent is tough would be equal to the prior probability. So if beta is smaller than 1, then this probability will be larger than P0. So this means that having some probability that that having beta strictly positive will induce a revising of the beliefs that the empire is tough, such that the probability that the empire is tough will be larger than P0. And this is the impressive, the impressive effect of fighting in period 1 on the reputation, especially on the beliefs held by colony 1 that the empire is tough. So, now, since this probability is then larger than P0, Then, for the same reasoning as for the one period case, so the second period is like a static case. It's like a one period game. It's like a one period game that starts not with the probability P0, but with this probability attached to the empire fighting, because this is the last period. So the second period is the last period. This means that if the empire is weak, is just bluffing, and entry occurs, the empire will accommodate. It has no reason to fight in the second period, because there is no future. Okay, so if this probability, as it is larger than P0, then fighting deters a weak entrant in the second period, and in equilibrium we must have then that indeed the weak incumbent fights for sure. So it fights for sure because in this way it avoids a weak entrant in period 2 to enter. And it is worthwhile for the weak empire to fight in the first period, because in this case the returns from reputation building exceeds the cost of reputation building. So this means that if we are in this situation, so we are always in the overarching case in which the probability that colonies are tough is not too large, more than some TWP. This is always the assumption. So, but in this situation here, we have that beta is equal to 1. So beta is the conditional the probability of fighting back entry in the first period given that entry occurs. So the probability for the empire for a weak empire to fight in the first colony given that entry occurs. And this means that the weak entrant will stay out. The weak entrant will stay out. So the tough entrant enters in any case. Okay. So we may have maybe an interval, a break of 10 minutes.